President George H. W. Bush, Republican, 41st President of the United States from 1989 to 1993. George Herbert Walker Bush was born in Massachusetts on June 12, 1924, and later moved to Connecticut. His father, Prescott Bush, was a Republican senator from Connecticut for 2 terms. George H. W. Bush attended Phillips Andover Academy as a teenager. On his 18th birthday, he graduated and enlisted in the United States Navy. He served during World War II from 1942 until 1945 and was the youngest pilot in the Navy at the time. He received a Distinguished Flying Cross for heroism under fire. While in the Navy, he married Barbara Pierce, and later he enrolled at Yale University. In 1966, he ran for a seat as a Republican in the U.S. House of Representatives. While a representative, he supported the Vietnam War and parts of the Great Society, including the Civil Rights Bill of 1968. In 1970, Richard Nixon appointed him as the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. He was in many positions in the 70s, including the chairman of the Republican National Committee, the U.S. envoy to the People's Republic of China, and the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And from 1980 to 1988, he served as vice president under Ronald Reagan. Finally, he became president in 1989. President George H. W. Bush was very successful in how he handled the foreign affairs that arose during his presidency. On August 2, 1990, Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, invaded the neighboring Kuwait. King Fahd of Saudi Arabia feared an invasion of his country as well, and requested U.S. military aid. This was initially met with Air Force fighter jets. Later, on January 17, 1991, Operation Desert Storm was launched with the coalition aircraft performing over 4,000 bombing runs. 4 weeks later, the ground invasion was launched and Iraq was effectively kicked out of Kuwait. What did you think about that?
I thought he was absolutely clear that Saddam Hussein should not be allowed to take over Kuwait and he would be forced to leave. And we went in and made sure that that happened.
Did you think it was the right decision?
I think it absolutely was. Where I think we needed to spend a little bit more thought was the end game. What were the necessary conditions of peace? When should combat have stopped? And unfortunately, Saddam Hussein was allowed to remain in power, and basically we set up the need to go back in and do it all over again a little more than a decade later.
मेरे को कुछ नहीं पता है हाँ और सारे अमेरिका क्या इतना बैन बजाया है हमारा इतना पूरा सारे पूरा गार्बेज कर दिया गार्बेज.
After the Gulf War, the Bush administration used the decisive victory to revitalize the Arab-Israeli peace process. Their efforts resulted in the Madrid Conference of 1991, a peace conference co-sponsored by the United States and the Soviet Union. It was followed by numerous negotiations and meetings between many of the Middle Eastern countries. Another issue arose nearby in Somalia. A humanitarian disaster was imminent with a complete breakdown in civil order. The United Nations created the UNOSOM-1 mission in April 1992, but this effort failed. Bush proposed American aid to the region, and the UN Security Council unanimously adopted Resolution 794 on December 3, 1992. Bush launched Operation Restore Hope the following day, which meant that the U.S. would assume command in accordance with Resolution 794. Fighting would escalate and continue into the Clinton administration. During his presidency, Bush managed to dramatically improve relations with the Soviet Union in a way few thought imaginable. President Bush and Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev had meetings at Malta, D.C., and Moscow, where they signed the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or START. This treaty reduced the nuclear arsenal of both countries. Also, Bush reacted incredibly calmly to the collapse of the Berlin Wall, which prevented a possible backlash of Eastern European countries. The 2+4 approach reunited the German states, and the new Germany would later be admitted to NATO. A situation arose in Europe when Yugoslavia began to break apart. The Bush administration hoped to prevent violence and bloodshed so that the breakup could proceed democratically. However, after Bush left office, the former Yugoslavian republics were in the midst of wars for years. In North America, Bush's administration, along with the Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, spearheaded the negotiations of the North American Free Trade Agreement, or NAFTA. This would eliminate a majority of tariffs between Canada, the US, and Mexico, and encourage trade between the three countries. Since the adoption of the agreement in 1993, the U.S. economy has grown by 54% and 25 million new jobs have been created. However, the agreement has not endured without criticism. For example, some argue that it has increased the U.S. deficit tremendously. In May 1989, Panama held democratic elections in which Guillermo Endara was elected president. However, Manuel Noriega, the Panamanian leader accused of spying for Castro and drug smuggling, annulled the results. Later, when a U.S. serviceman was shot by Panamanian forces in December 1989, Bush responded with Operation Just Cause. 24,000 troops were sent into Panama to remove Noriega from power and establish Endara as president. The mission was controversial, but a success. When addressing Congress about the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, Bush called for a new world order. He claimed this new order would be free from the threat of terror, stronger in the pursuit of justice, and more secure in the quest for peace. It would usher in a new era of world peace in which every corner could prosper and live in harmony. While this idealism was inspiring, it was mostly just idealism. Domestic affairs were not George H.W.'s strong suit during his presidency. He was not elected promising great change, but to rather maintain the status quo and the legacy of President Ronald Reagan. The Exxon Valdez oil spill occurred when the oil tanker Exxon Valdez, bound for Long Beach, California, struck Prince William Sound's reef on March 24, 1989. It spilled 260,000 to 750,000 barrels of crude oil over the span of a few days. It impacted about 1,300 square miles of shoreline and an overall impacted area of 11,000 square miles. This oil spill had both long and short-term effects regarding the deaths of many animals. The figures include 247 bald eagles, 2,800 sea otters, 22 orcas, as well as countless numbers of salmon and herring. It was extremely hard to begin operations to clean up, as Prince William Sound's remote location was only accessible by helicopter, plane, or boat. This severely taxed government and industry attempts and response. President George H.W. Bush's administration did not publicly state anything about the issue and seemingly ignored it. In fact, even the Environmental Protection Agency Administrator, William K. Riley, did not give a statement about the issue. The savings and loan crisis of the 1980s and 1990s was the failure of 1,043 out of the 3,234 savings and loan associations. These institutions accept savings deposits and make mortgage, car, and other personal loans to individual members. The problem was that these institutions used short-term money to make long-term loans. This caused the invention of creative accounting strategies that turned businesses into Ponzi schemes that look highly profitable but in fact make investors lose money. This increased fraud and eventually would collapse the economy of the nation. This major crisis was a reason why President George H.W. Bush could not implement many domestic programs. The Bush administration did what they could to slow the crisis, but unfortunately the crisis could not be averted. He proposed a compromise to bail out the industry, but it failed and ended up costing taxpayers over $100 billion. With no budget or continuing resolution on how to fix the economy, the government shut down from October 5th to October 9th of 1990. It came right after President Bush vetoed the original budget that Congress delivered to him. This stemmed out of President Bush's pledge not to raise taxes during his campaigning and how he was very hesitant to put the budget crisis on taxpayers. Unfortunately for President George H.W. Bush, he faced a Congress controlled by Democrats, who practically forced him to raise taxes.
My opponent won't rule out raising taxes, but I will, and the Congress will push me to raise taxes, and I'll say no, and they'll push, and I'll say no, and they'll push again, and I'll say to them, read my lips. No new taxes.
President Bush depended on his veto power to prevent Congress from raising taxes. In fact, he vetoed 44 bills during his tenure, and Congress only overrode one. The Omnibus Reconciliation Act of 1990 stemmed from the government shutdown. It included measures to reduce the deficit by cutting government expenditures and raising taxes. This act was signed into law on November 5, 1990, and countered his 1988 campaign promise not to raise taxes. The act included the Budget Enforcement Act of 1990, which established the pay-as-you-go process for discretionary spending and taxes. It practically increased all taxes and extended other tax services such as the Airport and Airway Trust Fund taxes, increasing them by 25%. It also permanently extended the 3% federal telephone excise tax on telephone service.